thank you very much for your kind words. I am very proud to think of myself as a friend of Iceland and a friend of Icelandic democracy. I've been a regular and appreciative visitor to this island for the past 20 years. Things have changed for you and for me. One of the things that's changed for me is I've just been re-elected to the European Parliament. And there is... I should quit there, really. Time for questions. But I tell you, there is nothing like going through an election campaign to remind elected representatives of the full diversity of wildlife that we represent in our constituencies. I can see one or two politicians here. They know what I'm talking about. I was canvassing in a part of my region called the Isle of Wight, and I came across a farmer who told me this very involved story about a seed bull that he'd purchased, a pedigree animal, that apparently just wouldn't do the business. He put it with all of his heifers, it wouldn't serve any of them, and he was in despair. And then on the internet, he discovered this wonderful drug. He mixed it in with the meal of the bull, and bingo, the bull couldn't get enough of it. All of his heifers were in calf. He was absolutely delighted, and he told me he was very alarmed because he'd heard that Brussels was going to ban this substance. And I said, well, sir, I will look into that for you. What's it called? He said, well, I can't rightly remember the name, but I can tell you that it tastes of aniseed. And then I was canvassing in a little town called Woking, and I knocked on one door that was answered by a small boy who must have been about 6 years old. And he was wearing a great kind of smoking jacket that was hanging loosely from his shoulders. In one hand, he was swirling a great balloon of brandy. It was about the size of his little head. And in the other, smouldering slowly ceilingwards, was what looked like a very expensive Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down and I said, are your parents at home? And he said, does it effing look as though my parents are at home? But it is wonderful to be back here, and it is wonderful to note the transformation. You'll permit me a small personal observation when I say that sometimes gradual change is not obvious to us when we're permanently living in a place. And coming here every few years, I've been struck by the amazing miracle of economic development that has taken place since I first came here nearly 20 years ago. It's worth stressing this point because we all know, you know better than anybody, that this country has been through hard times recently. But we shouldn't forget the magnitude of the achievement that took Iceland from where it was a generation ago to where it is today. The ingenuity and enterprise of a people who have moved in such a short time from an agrarian and fishing economy to one of the highest standards of living in the world. And you achieved that because of the greatest natural resource that any country can have, which isn't hot water or fish, it's the education and enterprise of a disciplined population. And it's an amazing achievement. So I'm talking to you today, as I say, as your chairman says, as a friend of Iceland. And you're going to be making possibly this huge decision about whether to change the terms of your relationship with Europe. I want to begin by saying that whatever you decide, I will be on your side. You're a sovereign people. You're an independent democracy. If you choose to exercise your sovereignty in such a way as to merge it with other countries, I will try and salvage as good terms for you as I can when the proposal comes through the European Parliament. And if you decide to retain your system of independent parliamentary self-government, then of course I will support you until the happy day when the United Kingdom is also allowed its referendum and we can rejoin you in the European Free Trade Association. When you see an allied country, a friendly people, about to repeat your experience, it seems to me that one of the duties, one of the obligations of friendship is to talk about how it has affected you, to share your experience. So let me say a thing or two about how the European Union has impacted the United Kingdom. The first point to make is that we joined out of despair. We joined at our worst moment as a country. The 1970s were the nadir of the British post-war experience. We had permanent strikes, we had power cuts, we had a 3-day week, we had trade unions subverting our democratic process, we had the calamity of the Wilson and Heath governments. That was the circumstances in which we joined, or took the decision to join in 1972, and then ratified the decision in a referendum 3 years later. It's significant, by the way, that we never had a referendum on joining. We had a referendum on staying in, by which time, of course, the government was able to argue that we burned our bridges, we're committed now, we've made all the tough decisions, we can't let down our new friends. But you know, we wouldn't have made that decision either 10 years before or 10 years later. The necessary pessimism would have been missing. And having gone in, at our lowest moment, we found that we'd locked in a number of the problems that we thought we were getting away from. Let me begin with the first thing we noticed, which was marginal for us, but I think maybe more important here, which was our experience in the common fisheries policy. Under the terms of the CFP, 65% of fish stocks in the North Sea were in British territorial waters. But we were allocated a quota by the European Union that amounted to 25% by volume or 15% by value. The industry went into immediate and precipitate decline, and of course, skippers started selling their licenses because they couldn't carry on operating insolvency. The licenses were bought up by foreign vessels that then started fishing against the British quota. In 1988, the House of Commons realized that most of the British quota was being taken up by Spanish boats, by vessels, that is to say, landing their catches in Spanish ports. And we passed an act of parliament called the Merchant Shipping Act that said if you wanted to register as a British boat, you had to have some kind of connection with the United Kingdom. You had to either fish from a British port or you had to have a percentage of your crew who were British nationals. The European Court struck down that ruling. And the British courts automatically upheld the European Court of Justice's interpretation. Because, and this is a point that even now is not widely understood, nearly 40 years after we joined, the European Union is not an association of states. It's not a group of countries bound one to another by international treaty. It creates a new legal order that has primacy within the member states. And if there is a conflict, even between an explicit, declared act of parliament and a ruling by the EU institutions, the domestic courts of the member state will automatically uphold the decision of the EU against its own statute. Of course, the dispute over who owned the fish in the North Sea soon became academic, because we've witnessed in the North Sea an ecological calamity with the wiping out of stocks. And why did that happen? Well, it happened because of an intrinsic flaw in the common fisheries policy, which is it defines all of the fish stocks in all of the territorial waters as a common resource. That's the phrase, a common resource to which all member states have equal access. Now, those of you here who are conservatives will automatically know this, but I don't think you have to be a conservative to recognize that basic Aristotelian wisdom that that which nobody owns, nobody will care for. It's the tragedy of the commons. How do you persuade a skipper to tie up his boat when he knows that vessels from other countries are plying the waters that he would otherwise be fishing? And so you get this race after a diminishing resource, and you then get to the situation that the European Union has reached today, where having depleted the stocks within its own waters, we have to spend colossal sums of taxpayers' money buying up the right to fish off Africa, so that the Spanish and Portuguese trawlermen who have exhausted their own catches can find new waters around the world.